We are a scrap processing facility. That means that we buy the material and process it in a form that mills, steel mills, aluminum mills, copper and brass mills, foundries can consume in their furnaces to produce new metal. The material goes to China, it goes to Korea, Thailand, starting to ship into Vietnam, India, some into Japan. It's consumed by what would otherwise be a U.S. mill. Now that material is going to foreign mills. We've killed our industrial base. We've killed or are killing what made us a great nation. We're giving it to China, to India, to all the other nations of the world to produce our goods, and we're a net importer when we should be a net exporter. The only thing we're net exporting is scrap.
There have been reports that China may indeed start to liquidate some of their treasury holdings.
The Chinese are the second largest holder of U.S. treasuries.
$9 trillion of outstanding U.S. treasuries in total. China holds $400 billion of them.
And it's a huge amount of money.
It's so huge, Sue, it's called China's nuclear option, as you know, and that refers to financial, not ballistic weapons.
If you want to know how it works in Washington, basically, China gets what it wants. We're going to be increasingly dependent on China for our own economic health, so we're going to have to figure out a way to get along with them.
In the fall of 1956, the world was on the brink of a major international conflict. America's allies, Britain and France, were engaged in a battle against Egypt over control of the Suez Canal. The Soviet Union was threatening to intervene on the side of Egypt. America wanted to avoid military action at any cost and demanded that the British and French allies withdraw from the region. When their request was denied, the U.S. turned to financial warfare. America, which at that time owned much of England's debt, threatened to sell off or dump a significant part of its holdings in the British pound.
So, as far as going into any kind of military action under present conditions, of course we're not.
This would have effectively destroyed England's currency. The result? All British and French military forces withdrew from the Suez region within weeks. Some historians consider this the exact moment that the British Empire ceased to exist.
It took 42 presidents, 224 years to run up $1 trillion of U.S. debt held abroad. This president has more than doubled that amount in just 6 years. Last year, we borrowed 65% of all the money that was borrowed in the world by countries, 10 times as much as the next biggest borrower. That's why this debt is jumping so dramatically, and it just fundamentally threatens our long-term economic security. If we don't deal with this, our children and grandchildren are going to have a much different life than we have enjoyed. We'll be in such deep hawk to the rest of the world, we'll be dependent on the kindness of strangers. We'll be dependent on other countries continuing to loan us vast amounts of money.
If 15 or 20 years from now, 2 or 3% of the GDP is being paid abroad merely to service the debts or the ownership of assets that have been incurred because we're over-consuming, that will be politically unstable.
We finance these deficits and this debt by borrowing money from other countries, the Chinese, for example. What implications does this have for our foreign policy if we're in hock to other governments? Does that give an American president flexibility to make foreign policy decisions, or do we have to worry about what our bankers think?
We have to worry about what our bankers think. You know, when the debt clock was turned off, I thought this is going to get ugly, because it sends a signal that the problem is solved. And those of us that were looking at the long-term numbers knew that the problem really wasn't solved, and frankly weren't very surprised to see the debt clock go back on again a few years later.
Just before we leave Money Matters this evening, in New York City today, the man who owns the national debt clock has decided to start it again. It shows the United States owes more than $66,000 for every American family. That's more than $6 trillion in all. The sign's owner turned it off almost 2 years ago, and now he says we need to be reminded that the surplus is gone and that deficit spending is back.
Well, my father had many ideas of how to bring out the growing danger of the debt. At one point, he sent out a New Year's card, to all the people in Congress and the Senate, saying, "Happy New Year, you owe the federal government $30,000. When we put this sign up, we moved it from around the corner, and we put it up over the entrance to the IRS, which we thought was very appropriate. The Clinton presidency, the clock we had then, could not run backwards, so we covered it up with an American flag. This clock will be able to run backwards. Hopefully we'll get to a point where we can do that. We're rapidly approaching $9 trillion. Unless we're able to reverse the growing deficit soon, we're going to have to order up a new sign."
As our mothers told us when we were growing up, when you have a little bit of extra money, be careful to make sure it doesn't burn a hole in your pocket. Well, quite frankly, it burned a hole through the pocket, through the floor, and, a good way through the planet.
Do you think there's a risk of a recession? How do you rate that?
You need to talk to economists. I think I got a B in Econ 101. I got an A, however, in keeping taxes low and being fiscally responsible with the people's money. States and our allies have prevailed.
Controversy since being sworn in as Treasury Secretary on January 20th, 2001. There is no doubt O'Neill has a very difficult job.
President Bush 43 asked me to come back to the government and be the Secretary of the Treasury, which I did for 23 months before I got fired for having a difference of opinion.
For the record, the White House is saying that Treasury Secretary Paul O'Neill and top economic advisor Larry Lindsey tendered their resignations voluntarily.
The Vice President said the President's decided